It started with a letter. Not a knock at the door, not a neighborly chat over the fence. Just a cold, crisp envelope tucked into the mailbox, bearing the unmistakable logo of the Homeowners Association. The kind of letter you glance at, then immediately feel a pinch in your stomach. The kind that doesn't carry good news. The paper was thick, the font overly formal, and the message disturbingly clear. My garden was in violation of community aesthetic standards. Offensive, they said, not merely untidy or overgrown. Offensive, as if the colors I chose, the wildflowers I nurtured, the vines that crept lovingly over my archways somehow insulted the sensibilities of the neighborhood. They gave me 10 days to remedy the matter or face escalating fines. I stood there, reading it again under the late morning sun, surrounded by bees buzzing in lavender, marigolds blooming in chaotic glory, and a soft rustling of wind chimes. My garden wasn't offensive. It was alive, and that, I thought, was what truly bothered them. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe a new intern at the HOA got a little overzealous. Maybe someone confused my address. So I did the sensible thing. I wrote a polite email asking for clarification. 2 days later, I got another letter, hand-delivered and sealed, signed this time by the HOA President herself, Marlene Whitaker. I didn't know much about her. We'd exchanged pleasantries once or twice at block parties, where she always hovered near the refreshments table, adjusting platters that didn't need adjusting. She had a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. Her signature was rigid and bold on the letter, as if daring me to challenge her authority. She cited violations, excessive ground cover inconsistent with community landscape palette, non-uniform elevation and rock arrangement, and, my favorite, visual discordance with adjacent property symmetry. I stared at those words, trying to figure out how a flower bed could be an act of rebellion. Still, I trimmed a few hedges. I rearranged a few stones. I pulled out 2 of the larger vine plants that I genuinely liked but figured were likely discordant. I even painted the border fence to match the approved HOA neutral beige tone. Then I sent photos to the HOA, asking for confirmation that the issue had been resolved. No response. A week passed. Then another letter came, this time with a fine, $250 for continued noncompliance. There was no explanation of what was still out of order, just the fine and a warning. Further disregard for HOA standards will result in legal escalation. That's when something shifted in me. I started watching, not just my own garden, but the entire street. I took morning walks with my coffee in hand, making mental notes. I saw flamingo statues on one lawn, multicolored solar lights on another, an inflatable unicorn float tied to someone's mailbox. None of it matched any community aesthetic, but none of those homes were fined. So why mine? Then I began hearing things. Whispers from neighbors, careful conversations. One woman, Denise, who lived 2 doors down, hesitated before telling me in a lowered voice that Marlene had a thing about gardens. Especially ones that draw attention, she said. She likes everything flat and trimmed. Anything expressive sets her off. Apparently, mine wasn't the first yard to draw Marlene's ire. Another couple had tried to install a bird bath with a bronze sculpture. Nothing gaudy, just artistic, and were slapped with 3 fines in 1 month. They moved out 6 weeks later. It was more than personal taste. It was about control. I noticed Marlene drove by slowly each morning. I'd see her car creeping along, her face partially obscured by sunglasses, a clipboard resting on the passenger seat. A few times, she stopped in front of my house for a full minute before driving on. Once I waved. She didn't wave back. One evening, after receiving yet another fine, I decided to confront her. Not in anger, just clarity. I knocked on her door, polite smile ready, questions in hand. But she didn't answer. I could hear music from inside. Laughter. Footsteps. But no response. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse over her tall backyard fence. It was quick, a flash of colorful lights, the hum of a machine, and a metallic clang followed by a cheer. It was strange and out of place. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was having a party. Maybe her kids were visiting. But then it happened again the next weekend. The lights, the sounds, the muted excitement. Always at night. always just loud enough to notice if you were listening. The next letter from the HOA came with a threat to lien my home if I didn't remove what they now labeled unauthorized vertical plant features. That's when I stopped caring about diplomacy. I took photos. I documented everything. My garden, my modifications, my communication attempts. And I started asking around, quietly, carefully. That's when an older neighbor named Russ pulled me aside during an afternoon walk. "You didn't hear it from me," he said, "but there's something real strange going on back there." He jerked his thumb toward Marlene's property. "Back where?" I asked. "Her backyard," he whispered. "A lot of folks seen it. Lights, cars coming late, delivery trucks. My buddy swears he saw a roulette wheel through the slats." I blinked. "At what?" He nodded, voice low. "Roulette. Like in Vegas." I didn't believe him. Not fully, but it planted a seed, and I watered it with curiosity. I stayed up late that weekend. I watched. I counted 4 unfamiliar cars pull up quietly and park a block away. Guests walked casually past her house and disappeared behind the fence. Hours later, they re-emerged, laughing, hurried, one of them fumbling with a stack of cash as he got into his car. The hypocrisy was too much to ignore. Here she was persecuting me for growing sunflowers and creeping jasmine while she was running, what? A gambling ring? An actual illegal casino? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. I felt dangerous. Marlene Whitaker had the kind of presence that made people stand straighter when she entered a room. She didn't speak loudly or wave her authority like a flag. She didn't need to. Her authority was stitched into the fabric of the neighborhood, like the clean lines of a well-manicured hedge or the rigid symmetry of freshly painted mailboxes. People didn't question her. They just adjusted. She was the HOA president and had been for years. No one really remembered how it started. Maybe it was a bake sale. Maybe she organized a block party once and liked the way it felt to coordinate things, to direct. From there, the position seemed to graft itself onto her identity. She wasn't just a homeowner. She was the homeowner, keeper of the rules, defender of community integrity, and, increasingly, the final word in all things. Her house, at first glance, mirrored the kind of order she demanded from others. The lawn was a perfect square of green, trimmed with an almost obsessive precision, not a blade of grass out of place. Her shutters were a classic colonial blue, always freshly painted. Seasonal reeds appeared on her door exactly on schedule, never too early, never too late. Christmas lights came down by January 2nd. Flags changed with federal holidays. Even the cracks in her driveway seemed to heal faster than the rest of ours. And yet, something about it all felt sterile, like a showroom pretending to be a home. You couldn't imagine children running barefoot across her lawn or music playing from an open window. It was too quiet, too curated. Marlene herself matched the house. Her blonde hair was always styled in the same hard bob, her lipstick a color that hadn't changed in years, as if she'd chosen one appropriate shade and committed to it. She wore beige and navy like they were uniforms and walked with clipped, efficient steps that never gave the impression of leisure. She introduced herself to new residents with a smile that felt memorized. "Welcome to the neighborhood. We're so happy to have you," she'd say, offering a clipboard with HOA bylaws already highlighted. She'd stand just inside your personal space, just enough to make you step back. She wasn't rude. She was meticulous. And meticulous people, in her mind, kept the world in order. But there were cracks in the foundation. People talked, quietly, and only when they were sure no one else was listening. Stories about Marlene pressuring a widow into repainting her house after her husband died. About her finding a veteran for flying the wrong size flag. About a teenager being banned from mowing lawns in the summer because unlicensed services weren't allowed. But no one ever challenged her directly. Because when you did, strange things happened. Mail went missing. Trash pickup skipped your address for a week. A violation letter showed up with vague accusations and no specific citations. If you appealed, the appeal would mysteriously get lost in processing. It became clear over time that she didn't just enforce the rules, she was the rules. And she used them like weapons. I watched as neighbors complied with things they didn't agree with simply to avoid the confrontation. A bright blue mailbox painted over with HOA beige. A garden gnome removed in the dead of night. Porch lights replaced with HOA-approved models. Slowly, the neighborhood began to feel like a place where expression was something you kept hidden, like contraband. I started to realize that Marlene didn't care about harmony. She cared about control. And the garden violation she'd thrown at me was less about aesthetics and more about making sure I knew my place. After I started resisting, the frequency of her patrols increased. She began showing up unannounced, walking the sidewalk in front of my house with a camera slung over her neck. Click, click, snapshots of my flower beds, of the fence, of a hose coiled slightly out of line. Once, she leaned over the gate and peered in, notebook in hand. She made notes while standing on her tiptoes. I watched from the window, jaw tight, feeling like a suspect under surveillance. I noticed she never parked in her driveway. Always a few houses down. Always with the engine still warm, ready to leave quickly. That made me curious. Why not park in her own space? So I began to watch her the same way she watched me. I saw her routine. Same time every morning, 7:12 a.m. On the dot, she drove slowly past my house, her eyes scanning every inch. At first, I thought it was about me. Then I saw she did it to others, too. Her car would glide down the block like a slow-moving shadow. I'd catch her scribbling notes. Once, I saw her take a photo of a kid's bicycle left on a front lawn. The next day, the family got a violation notice. People joked that she must have a team helping her, but it was always just her. One woman with too much time, too much authority, and no one willing to push back. Until I did. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed her odd behavior. A neighbor named Paul told me he'd once installed a porch swing and got a violation letter before he'd even finished hanging it. She must have been watching from somewhere, he muttered, like a hawk. Another neighbor, Angela, said Marlene once sent her a formal warning because her wind chimes were too audible. When she asked how that was measured, the HOA responded with a decibel limit, but didn't say how it was enforced. It's like dealing with a dictator in khakis, Angela joked. What struck me most was that none of them had filed a complaint. They just lived around her, tolerated her, adapted. No one wanted to stir up trouble, because trouble had a name, and it was Marlene Whitaker. So the violations kept coming. The intimidation continued. But in all that time, no one ever stepped foot on her property. No one ever questioned her. And I began to wonder, why? She enforced rules with an iron grip, but somehow, her own backyard remained off-limits. No HOA member ever mentioned it. No open house events were held there. No holiday tours. It was as if a curtain had been drawn around it, and no one dared peek behind. Until I did. And what I saw behind that curtain would unravel everything she'd built. Because even tyrants have secrets, and sometimes they hide them just past the patio. I began with a list. It was nothing official, just a worn notebook with scribbles, dates, times, and what I saw or heard from my window. At first, it felt a little absurd. I wasn't a private investigator or some nosy neighbor with too much time on my hands. I was someone who planted a garden and got targeted for it. But the more I wrote, the more I realized something was off, something deeper than power-hungry HOA control. On a Thursday night, I saw it again. Marlene's backyard flickered with lights that didn't belong in a residential zone. Faint strobes of red and green that pulsed behind tall fences. I couldn't see much directly from the street, but I heard it, the rhythmic clink of glass, faint music, occasional bursts of laughter. Not the kind of relaxed laughter you hear at barbecue, but something sharper, louder. It sounded like celebration or victory. The next morning, 4 cars I didn't recognize pulled out of her driveway. One of them had tinted windows. Another had out-of-state plates. The kind of cars you don't see parked outside in our HOA-regulated community unless someone's renting an Airbnb, and rentals were strictly prohibited. That's when I remembered something Denise told me in passing. Don't be fooled by the rules she enforces. She doesn't always live by them herself. It echoed in my mind as I watched Marlene smile at a jogger, clipboard under her arm, eyes behind sunglasses. She walked like a sheriff, but I was starting to suspect she was more like a queen pin. I wanted proof, not just gossip or strange sounds. but real evidence. And I had just the tool for it, a small drone I'd bought a year ago for landscape photography. I hadn't used it much, but now it felt like fate had saved it for this exact moment. I launched the drone on a Saturday night, just as twilight softened the sky. I kept it low, close to rooftops, barely above treetops. It was quiet, nearly silent, and with a few practice runs, I'd figure out how to get close enough without triggering suspicion. I hovered above Marlene's backyard and tilted the camera downward. What I saw made my stomach twist. Tables. Not lawn furniture, but velvet-lined poker tables, complete with chip trays and cup holders. People were seated in suits and dresses, sipping from heavy glasses. There was a roulette wheel near the back porch. Strings of dim lights framed the perimeter of the yard, creating an almost cinematic glow. It looked like something from a movie, a private casino hidden in the heart of suburbia. There were at least 15 people present. 2 men near the back looked like hired security. I zoomed in and captured screenshots of their black outfits and earpieces. Everyone seemed comfortable, almost routine, as if this wasn't the first time, not by a long shot. I lowered the drone a little, careful not to cast a shadow. Marlene emerged from her sliding glass door, wearing a red silk blouse and black slacks. No clipboard, no tight bun, just her in command of the scene. She smiled as someone handed her a wad of bills. Not chips, bills. I recorded everything. After landing the drone, I sat in the dark, staring at the footage, replaying it over and over. This wasn't just a neighborhood oddity, it was illegal and risky. But what stunned me most was how confidently she hosted it all. Like she knew she wouldn't get caught. Like she couldn't. I started connecting dots. That councilman I'd seen before, driving slowly past Marlene's house last month, I saw him again in one of the video stills. He was sitting at the poker table, laughing with a drink in hand. That explained the silence from city code enforcement. Political insulation. She had power, not just here in the neighborhood, but above it too. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind spun with possibilities. What if I went to the police and they brushed it off? What if she found out it was me? I'd seen what she could do with HOA authority. What could she do with actual leverage? I needed to be strategic. The next morning, I backed up the drone footage onto a USB drive and stored it in a separate location, just in case. Then, I printed a few still images and stored them in a folder labeled Garden Photos, tucked between old magazines. I returned to watching. Night after night, more cars came. The gatherings grew larger, the noise less concealed. I began to believe Marlene didn't care who knew because no one ever dared act. So I decided I would. But first, I needed to be sure I wasn't alone. I started talking to neighbors in casual ways, asking if they'd noticed the strange traffic on our street, if they'd heard odd sound from Marlene's backyard. Most of them brushed it off, not out of disbelief but fear. Some looked around before answering. One woman simply said, "Don't ask questions about Marlene," and hurried inside. But Paul, the retired electrician, didn't. He nodded solemnly when I brought it up. "She's been running something back there for years. We just pretend not to see." "Why?" I asked. He gave me a hard look. "Because she makes the rules. And people like her don't get caught. They get protected." It was then I realized something important. Marlene's power wasn't just in her position. It was in everyone's silence. She ruled with fear, but her real weapon was the community's unwillingness to confront her. That gave me an advantage. I wasn't afraid anymore. The next day, I called an old friend who worked in journalism. I didn't tell them much, just that I had a tip and evidence to back it up. We agreed to meet in person. Later that night, I prepared a clean copy of the drone footage, added timestamp notes, and included a brief report about the HOA fines, her enforcement patterns, and the connections I suspected. I didn't accuse. I showed. There was a difference. I watched as the USB drive transferred the files. Bar by bar, piece by piece, the truth was moving out of my hands and into someone else's. I knew it wouldn't be long now. I didn't know if it would be the police, or the press, or some quiet city official who started the storm. But it was coming. And Marlene, for the first time, wouldn't see it until it was too late. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. Her lights were on. Her backyard was quiet for now. But that night, I slept peacefully, because I was no longer just a gardener under siege. I was a witness. And soon, The whole neighborhood would see what bloomed behind her perfect fences. The days following the handoff of the USB drive were slow and charged with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept waiting for a shift, something to crack or quake or explode, but on the surface, nothing changed. Marlene still walked her patrol route like clockwork, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on even in the early morning. Her steps were confident, perhaps even smug. She still gave nods to neighbors, issued warnings for unauthorized porch plants, and wielded power like it was oxygen. If anything, she seemed more self-assured than ever. But I knew what was coming, and so did the journalist. His name was Simon Dale. We'd known each other years back through a community environmental initiative. He'd gone on to cover regional politics and small-town corruption, building a reputation for quietly dismantling local tyrants with precision and evidence. When I showed him the footage, he didn't say much, just watched, leaned back, and smiled. People like her think they're invincible until someone watches them closer than they watch everyone else. I gave him everything: timestamps, witness names, only those who agreed to be included, and a written timeline of Marlene's increasingly authoritarian HOA behavior. He asked if I wanted credit. I shook my head. I didn't need to be the face of this story. I just wanted it told. By midweek, whispers started. They began quietly, as they always do, on sidewalks, at the mailboxes, between neighbors with narrowed eyes and half-finished sentences. Someone said they saw a reporter in the neighborhood. Someone else said there were inquiries made at City Hall. Angela swore she saw someone with a camera near Marlene's property at dusk. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt it. Marlene's tone shifted too. She issued 2 citations that week, both absurd, both aggressive. One for a lawn gnome that violated community harmony. Another for a welcome mat that contained unapproved colors. These weren't just rules. They were warnings. A sign she felt something stirring. And then, like a match dropped on dry grass, everything ignited. The article dropped on a Friday morning. The headline was sharp and surgical. Behind the fence. How an HOA president turned a suburban community into a shadow casino. It was bold. It was specific. And it had pictures. Still images from the drone. Footage of cash exchanging hands. Quotes from anonymous residents. The article outlined everything. The abuse of power, the secret gatherings, the apparent political protection shielding her. It was backed with detail, documentation, and a tone that made it clear this wasn't speculative. It was exposé journalism at its finest. I watched from my window as the neighborhood came alive in ways I'd never seen before. Neighbors on porches, phones in hand, reading aloud. Cars slowing down in front of Marlene's house. A news van parked at the corner before noon. By mid-afternoon, 2 city inspectors arrived, followed by what looked like undercover officers. No lights, no fanfare, just quiet presence. Still, Marlene held her composure. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, posture straight. When questioned, she smiled. She invited the inspectors inside. Her mask didn't crack, not visibly. But as the sun began to fall, I noticed her hands tremble as she locked her front door. The neighborhood watched her now, not with fear, but with suspicion. The illusion had shattered. Her power had always depended on the myth of perfection, the appearance of untouchability. But now her gates had been breached, and she knew it. Over the next few days, the HOA board convened emergency meetings. For the first time, members who had long remained silent began to speak. One resigned. Another publicly apologized for failing to provide balanced leadership. A motion was introduced to temporarily suspend Marlene's powers pending investigation. Her reaction was swift and theatrical. She denied everything, claimed the footage was manipulated, called it a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled residents with personal vendettas. But the proof was overwhelming, and her control, so absolute for so long, had finally met resistance she couldn't find or threaten away. She issued a neighborhood letter on HOA letterhead, dripping with passive-aggressive calm. Recent reports have sought to damage the unity of our community with unfounded accusations. I remain committed to the values and beauty of our neighborhood. Please continue to follow the regulations for the good of all. No one responded. For the first time since I lived there, porch decor began to vary. Someone planted sunflowers in their front yard. A swing appeared on a porch. The gnome that had been sighted before came back, this time painted gold. People began reclaiming space. Not loudly, but defiantly. The investigation escalated quickly. According to Simon's updates, the gambling charges alone were being taken seriously. And when city officials began digging, they found more: unregistered income, misuse of HOA funds, possible zoning violations. A financial paper trail had begun to form behind the shadows of her backyard empire. When 2 federal vehicles arrived a week later, it was over. No cuffs, no yelling, just quiet conversation and a sealed envelope. Marlene didn't look out from her windows after that. Her patrol stopped. The clipboard never returned. Some believed she cut a deal. Others said she fled to a second home she secretly owned in Arizona. But no one missed her. The absence of her presence was a release, like the first breeze after a summer storm. People began to talk again, laugh again. The neighborhood, once painted in one shade of dull beige, bloomed with color and personality. Simon's article was shared across multiple news outlets. HOA watchdogs referenced it. Forums erupted in debate. And beneath all that, in the quiet of our little street, a sense of accountability returned. Not because someone stepped down, but because someone had finally stood up. Marlene had ruled from behind the illusion of community standards. But she underestimated one thing. Gardens grow in defiance. And so do people. The aftermath of Marlene's downfall wasn't immediate chaos, as some might expect when a central authority figure is removed. Instead, it was like the slow exhale after years of breath being held too tightly. The neighborhood didn't erupt, it realigned. Subtle shifts began to take place. A house that once seemed uniform in tone and temperament suddenly showed its diversity, not just in color or decoration, but in spirit. In the days that followed the investigation, a temporary HOA committee was appointed to stabilize operations. They were made up of longtime residents, those who had always attended meetings but were rarely heard, overshadowed by Marlene's dominance. With her gone, their voices found new volume. They weren't power-hungry. In fact, many seemed reluctant to take charge, which is probably why they were the right people for the job. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about healing. One of the first things the interim board did was put a freeze on all pending citations and fines. Residents who had been penalized for trivial things, like the height of a fence post or the color of their flower pots, were told their cases would be reviewed, and most were dismissed outright. The community sighed with relief. It felt like justice, but without vengeance. Meanwhile, I kept a low profile. Despite being the initial whistleblower, I hadn't been named in Simon's article, per my request. But rumors naturally swirled. A few neighbors approached me, not to accuse, but to thank. Some did it with a handshake, others with a silent nod or a plate of cookies left on my doorstep. It was their way of saying, "We know what you did, and we're grateful." Still, not everyone was at ease. There were remnants of Marlene's presence that lingered. People who had benefited from her rule or who had grown accustomed to the quiet tyranny because it kept things in order. They weren't angry, exactly, just unsettled. Change, even good change, can be uncomfortable. Some of them try to float the idea that maybe the whole situation had been exaggerated, that maybe the so-called casino had just been private gatherings. But no one gave those theories much weight. Not with the pictures, the testimonies, and the official investigation still underway. A few weeks later, a community meeting was held, the first true town hall-style gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. It was held in the local community center instead of Marlene's tightly controlled HOA office. Chairs were arranged in a circle, not in rows, to foster transparency and conversation. That alone spoke volumes. I attended, though I sat near the back. I wasn't looking for recognition. I just wanted to see the neighborhood face itself honestly. And that night it did. People spoke freely about the fear they used to feel, about the exhaustion of conforming to standards that felt more like personal preferences than communal values. One woman tearfully described how she stopped planting flowers 3 years ago after being fined for growing non-native species. Another man admitted he'd stopped inviting friends over after getting written up for parking congestion. For a long time, everyone thought they were alone in their discomfort. Now they knew they weren't. The interim board listened. They didn't deflect or defend. They took notes, nodded, asked questions. By the end of the night, they had proposed a full review of the HOA charter with community involvement, something that had never been done before. Everyone would have a voice. Everyone would vote on revisions. It felt democratic, like the way things should have been all along. In the following weeks, task forces formed, not for enforcement but for engagement. A gardening club was revived. A neighborhood newsletter was proposed. Community cleanup days were planned, not as punishments for violations, but as ways to build pride and connection. I watched it all unfold with quiet amazement. The same fences that had once marked territory now hosted string lights and art. Front yards blossomed with new color. People talked more, waved more. A new family moved in and was welcomed instead of scrutinized. The fear had lifted, and then came a letter. Not from the HOA, not from the city. From Marlene. It arrived in a plain white envelope, addressed to residents of Willow Creek Estates. Inside was a typed message, formal, distant. In it, she acknowledged stepping away from her position and expressed regret that her methods had caused discomfort. She denied wrongdoing, but there was a tone, muted and unfamiliar, of weariness. Perhaps even defeat. At the bottom was a final sentence that stood out. I believed I was protecting this community. I see now that I was only protecting control. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was something. We didn't respond. We didn't need to. Instead, we moved forward. One Saturday, I stood in my garden, the very one that had triggered the whole conflict. It had grown wilder since then, more colorful. Lavender, daisies, creeping thyme, even a few bright red poppies. No more citations. No one came by to measure spacing or critique aesthetic compatibility. A few neighbors walked past and complimented it. One even asked for clippings to start their own. The irony wasn't lost on me. The garden that had once been offensive was now an emblem of renewal. Later that afternoon, a few children played in a nearby yard, their laughter floating on the breeze. Music played faintly from a house down the street. It was the kind of ordinary suburban afternoon that had once felt so tense, now peaceful. Marlene had ruled through silence, through compliance, through fear of confrontation. But once that veil was lifted, once people realized that they could speak, could question, could act, her empire fell apart. It wasn't about one garden. It never was. It was about the right to live authentically, to coexist without fear, to be part of a community rather than ruled by one. That day, as the sun dipped low in shadows, stretched across the lawn, I watered my plants in peace. No clipboard, no threats, just growth slow, steady, and finally free. Spring turned to summer, and with each passing week, the neighborhood transformed, not in sudden bursts, but in small, deliberate steps. The changes weren't loud. They didn't announce themselves. They arrived in flower beds filled with wild roses, in porch swings that creaked under lazy afternoons, in laughter heard echoing down streets that had once been silent and sterile. Freedom didn't come all at once. It came like sunlight after a storm, steady and warm. It had been nearly 3 months since Marlene's quiet exit. Her house, now up for sale, sat strangely empty. The neatly clipped hedges still stood, but without her constant presence, the property seemed less intimidating. Just another home, rather than a symbol of control. Occasionally, curious visitors stopped by with realtors, unaware of the history baked into its brick walls. Some neighbors joked that the property came with ghosts of policies past. No one missed her. Not really. Even those who once supported her admitted, in hushed tones, that things were better now. The HOA, under its new leadership, became more collaborative than authoritarian. A revised charter was drafted with resident input, and it emphasized community support, transparency, and voluntary participation rather than strict enforcement. Homeowners who had once kept their heads down began attending meetings regularly. And for the first time, people weren't showing up to defend themselves. They were showing up to contribute. The change wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, rough patches, moments where the new board stumbled or overcorrected. But people gave each other grace. They understood now that imperfection was part of growth. The neighborhood, once polished to the point of sterility, had become alive with character. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, not typed, not anonymous, but handwritten, sealed in a soft blue envelope. I recognized the name immediately. Joan, one of Marlene's closest former allies on the HOA board. She had resigned quietly during the peak of the scandal, and until now, I hadn't heard a word from her. The letter was brief but heartfelt. She wrote that she hadn't seen what Marlene had become until it was too late. She admitted being complicit by silence, by complacency. I thought I was keeping things orderly, she wrote. But I realize now that I was just keeping people afraid. I'm sorry for the role I played. And thank you for doing what the rest of us couldn't. I folded the letter and tucked it away, not out of sentimentality, but because it reminded me that even those who once stood on the wrong side could change, could see, could learn. As the neighborhood grew stronger, the story that started it all, the article, the footage, the fallout, faded into the background. It wasn't forgotten, just no longer the defining event. Life had moved on, but every so often, I'd noticed the subtle ways it lingered. The way people now knocked before issuing a complaint. The way a child's lemonade stand could appear without fear of unauthorized commerce. The way someone could hang fairy lights in a tree and be met not with a warning, but with admiration. It had become a neighborhood again, a real one. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. I was out in the yard, pruning a few stubborn branches when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman stepped out, middle-aged, tidy in appearance, but with tired eyes and a cautious demeanor. She looked around, then approached. "You're the one with the garden," she said. I nodded slowly, unsure what was coming next. I was a friend of Marlene's. Not a close one, but I knew her from another neighborhood. We served on a housing committee together years back. I just wanted to see the place she used to talk about so much. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. She continued. She wasn't always like that. She started with good intentions, I think. But somewhere along the line, the rules became the goal, not the people. I nodded again. That I understood. She's in Arizona now, the woman said, living with her sister. Quiet, disconnected. I don't think she'll ever run another HOA again. She left a small envelope in my hand before returning to her car. I didn't stop her. I didn't ask more questions. When I opened the envelope later, it contained a single photograph, an old one, judging by the fading edges. It showed Marlene in front of what looked like a community garden, smiling, surrounded by children and neighbors. On the back, someone had written, "Before." I stared at it for a long time. No one is born a tyrant. They become one, often slowly, by convincing themselves they're right, by surrounding themselves with fear instead of feedback. And yet, that same slow path can be walked in reverse. Not by everyone, but by some. In the end, my garden had never just been about flowers or aesthetics. It was a symbol, a quiet rebellion, a refusal to conform for conformity's sake. And through it, something had shifted, not just in policy, but in people. Summer waned, and as autumn approached, the leaves began to change, a brilliant reminder that even endings can be beautiful. Children prepared for Halloween. Neighbors planned a block party, something Marlene had once banned. This time, it was welcomed with enthusiasm. Tables were set up, lights strung across lawns, costumes laid out in windows. And me? I planted pumpkins, small ones, nestled between lavender and thyme. Not because it was regulation approved, but because I could. Because it made me smile. Because this was home now, no longer guarded, no longer policed. Just lived in. And for the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel like the absence of conflict. It felt like the presence of choice.